Arthur Percival sits down across the table from the man who just conquered Singapore. It's February 15th, 1942, and in a few minutes he'll surrender roughly 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops, the largest capitulation in British military history. But 5 years earlier, Percival had sat over a different table, studying a map of Malaya. He'd helped prepare a report describing where Japan was likely to land and how its army could move south towards Singapore. That predicted route just brought Japan straight to his door. So how does the man who saw this coming end up signing it away? Singapore wasn't just a naval base. It was proof that the British Empire could not be beaten in Asia. It was a fortress city built around 15-inch guns and a naval base that had cost £60 million to build. Ships could dock there for months at a time. Aircraft could refuel and rearm on the runways below the guns. People called it the Gibraltar of the East, and in London, that reputation had hardened into one very specific assumption. Any real attack would come from the sea, where those guns were already pointed. Percival had run the whole defense of Malaya since April 1941, reporting up a long chain of command that stretched all the way back to Winston Churchill himself in London. In February 1942, that entire chain was about to be tested by an army a third the size of his own. Rewind to 1937. Percival wasn't a general yet. He was a lieutenant colonel working as chief of staff for a different commander, Major General William Dobbie. Dobbie had an unusual idea. Instead of assuming Japan would never dare attack, he told his staff to think like the enemy. Percival did the work. He studied the coastline, the monsoon season, the map, and he came back with an answer nobody in London wanted to hear. Japan wouldn't need to sail straight at Singapore's big guns. It could land troops far to the north, near Kota Bharu, Singora and Patani, then push south through Malaya on foot. Mile after mile of rubber plantations and mangrove swamp, cut through by narrow dirt roads no one expected an army to use. The jungle everyone assumed would stop an army wouldn't stop this one, Percival's report said. Not even during the monsoon, when British planners insisted landings were impossible. Percival helped write all of this into an official report and sent it up to the War Office. What came back wasn't a rejection, it was mostly silence. A few defensive works got approved on paper, almost none of them got built. By the time Percival came back to Malaya in 1941, this time as the general in charge, the danger he'd described in 1937 hadn't gone away. It had just been sitting there, mostly unanswered, for 4 years. And here's the part most people get wrong. It wasn't only London that failed to fix it. When Percival's own chief engineer begged him to build those defenses, Percival said no. Not once, twice. On December 8, 1941, less than a day after Pearl Harbor, Japan landed at Kota Bharu, Singora and Patani, almost exactly where the 1937 report said they would. Leading the invasion was General Tomoyuki Yamashita. His men didn't wait for roads. Japanese infantry rode bicycles down jungle tracks the British had ridden off as impassable, tires hissing over wet dirt roads nobody had ever bothered to mine or block because nobody expected an army to use them. They covered 550 miles in 55 days. 2 days into the invasion, disaster hit the water. The battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse had no air cover at all when Japanese bombers found them. Bombs and torpedoes tore through both hulls in under 2 hours, and sailors who couldn't swim clear went down with the ships. They were supposed to be Britain's answer to the Japanese fleet. More than 800 sailors died. And here's the twist people still get wrong about this whole campaign. The massive coastal guns everyone blames didn't fail because they were welded facing the wrong way. Most of them could turn. 3 of the 5 heaviest guns rotated a full 360. But turning wasn't the problem. Their stockpiles were dominated by armor-piercing rounds built to punch through battleship hulls, with almost no high-explosive ammunition suited to troops in the open, and even when crews aimed them inland, poor observation posts made it hard to see where the shells were actually landing. They'd been built to fight ships. Japan came by land instead. By Boxing Day, with Japanese troops already tearing down the peninsula, Exactly as the 1937 report predicted, Percival's chief engineer, Ivan Simson, made one more appeal. "Build fixed defences on Singapore's northern shore," he said. It was the same landward danger Percival had been studying since 1937. Percival refused again. His reason: defences would be bad for morale. One of his own colleagues in Singapore put it more bluntly at the time, saying Percival ran his command like a peacetime parade ground, waiting for an umpire's whistle that was never going to blow. By then, Percival wasn't preparing for a possible invasion anymore. He was watching the one he'd predicted move toward him, and still refusing one measure that might have slowed it down. Singapore had spent decades preparing for a war that never came, and almost no time preparing for the one that did. By the end of January, Percival's exhausted army had retreated all the way back across the causeway onto Singapore Island itself. Engineers blew a hole in the causeway behind them. There was nowhere left to fall back to. That's what the famous story gets backward. If you're not subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of history we dig into every week. Back to Singapore, because the worst was still ahead. On February 8th, Japanese troops crossed the narrow strait onto Singapore itself. Within days, Japanese forces had captured key reservoirs and pumping stations, while broken mains drained away what water remained for over 1 million people crammed onto the island. Percival now had two disasters closing in at once: a Japanese army pushing toward the city, and a clock counting down to the moment the taps ran dry. By the morning of the 15th, Percival's own chief engineer reported that half the city's water pipes were already broken, with maybe 2 days of supply left. What Percival didn't know was that General Yamashita had a disaster of his own. His artillery had maybe a few hours of ammunition left, and his men were exhausted. Yamashita understood something Percival didn't. A bluff works if the other side is desperate enough to believe it. That evening, with the water supply for 1 million civilians about to fail, Percival walked into a plain assembly line office at the Ford Motor Factory and sat down across from Yamashita. Yamashita banged the table, pressed him for an immediate unconditional surrender, and threatened another attack that night. Percival had already been given a choice that morning: fight on and risk losing everyone in street fighting with the water already gone. Surrender and hand Japan the largest capitulation in British history. None of his senior commanders urged him to fight on. That evening, Percival signed. Roughly 80,000 British, Australian, Indian and Malay troops went into captivity. That's enough people to fill a football stadium. It remains the largest capitulation in British military history, just like Churchill would later call it. 3 days later, the killing didn't stop. It changed targets. Japanese soldiers began rounding up Singapore's Chinese population, screening men at checkpoints across the island. Men were pulled from the crowd, marked with a stamp or a torn scrap of paper, and marched off based on nothing more than a guard's gut feeling, then executed if they were judged a threat. Estimates range from the thousands into the tens of thousands. Nobody agrees on the exact number because so few records survived. Percival spent the next 3.5 years as a prisoner of war, and thousands of the men who surrendered with him were sent north to build a railway through the jungle for their captors, on starvation rations for years. Percival had seen the route years earlier, but when the money finally had to be chosen, Churchill prioritized the Mediterranean, North Africa, and aid to the Soviet Union. Malaya entered the campaign without a single tank and without the aircraft strength its commanders had requested. And when Percival finally took command himself, he added mistakes of his own on top of it. Those mistakes helped turn an inherited weakness into a total collapse. Singapore didn't fall because nobody saw Japan coming. It fell because recognizing the danger, preparing for it, and commanding through it turned out to be 3 very different things. I'm Zombo. If you made it this far, you're already part of the quest. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.